In the rugged mountains of Colorado Territory, 1885, a deadly secret is about to surface that will change everything. When Ezra Stone finds a horse dying beside a frozen creek, he thinks he's just saving an animal's life. But this isn't any ordinary rescue. The horse carries saddlebags containing documents that could topple the most powerful railroad baron in the West and expose a conspiracy that reaches all the way to Washington. For 20 years, Ezra has lived alone in these mountains, hiding from his past as a former Union cavalry officer. He wanted nothing more than peace and solitude. But when word spreads about what he's found, bounty hunters, federal marshals, and hired killers all converge on his remote cabin. Now this mountain man must decide whether to run, fight, or use these dangerous secrets to finally clear his name. What dark truth could be worth so many lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees, surrounding Ezra Stone's cabin like the ghosts of men he'd once commanded into battle. At 58, his weathered hands still moved with the precision of a soldier as he stoked the fire that would keep him alive through another Colorado winter. The cabin sat nestled in a natural hollow, protected on three sides by granite cliffs that rose like cathedral walls toward the pale morning sky. 20 years of solitude had taught Ezra to read the mountain's moods like scripture. Today felt different. The air carried a tension that made his old war wounds ache, the same feeling he'd learned to trust during his cavalry days when death rode just beyond the next ridge. He pulled his tarnished war medal from its hiding place beneath loose floorboards, running calloused fingers over the bronze surface. The Congressional Medal of Honor felt heavier each year, not from its weight, but from the memories it carried. Captain Ezra Stone had earned it at Gettysburg for saving 30 men from Confederate artillery fire. The same medal that should have guaranteed him respect had become evidence in his court-martial 2 decades later. The horse's labored breathing drew him from his bitter reflections. He'd found the animal collapsed beside Willow Creek yesterday evening, its foam-flecked coat steaming in the frigid air. Something about the horse's noble bearing suggested expensive breeding, far too fine for these remote mountains. Its saddle bore craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and purpose, though Ezra hadn't yet examined the saddlebags that might explain its presence. Moving with the careful efficiency of a man accustomed to tending wounded creatures, Ezra checked the animal's vital signs. The pulse remained weak but steady, and the fever that had burned through its body during the night was finally breaking. Years of caring cavalry mounts had taught him the delicate balance between medicine and hope that separated life from death in situations like these. "Easy there, friend," he murmured, running gentle hands along the horse's neck. "You're safe now." The animal's eyes tracked his movements with intelligence that surprised him. Most horses broken by exhaustion showed little awareness of their surroundings, but this one seemed to understand that it had found sanctuary. Ezra had constructed a makeshift stall in his barn using salvaged lumber and army blankets, creating warmth and shelter that would give the creature its best chance at recovery. His own recovery had taken much longer. The court-martial had destroyed everything he'd believed about honor and justice, leaving him with nothing but skills that seemed useless in peacetime. He'd fled west with a price on his head, seeking country remote enough that his past couldn't follow. These mountains had provided that sanctuary, demanding only that he prove worthy of their harsh hospitality. The morning ritual of survival consumed his attention as it had every day for 2 decades. Water hauled from the creek before it froze solid. Firewood split and stacked against the endless appetite of winter. Game trails checked for fresh sign that might provide the meat necessary to survive until spring's return. Each task performed with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through war and exile alike. But the horse's presence disrupted his carefully ordered existence. Someone would come looking for an animal this valuable, and Ezra's instincts warned him that such visitors might bring more danger than he was prepared to handle. The saddlebags remained unopened, but their weight suggested contents more significant than Tessef traveling supplies. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin's single room, Ezra found himself studying the medal again. The citation praised his courage under fire and his devotion to protecting innocent lives. Those same qualities had led to his downfall when he'd tried to prevent a massacre of Cheyenne women and children at Sand Creek. His commanding officer had branded him a traitor for refusing to participate in what history would remember as one of the Army's darkest moments. The horse nickered softly from its stall, a sound that carried surprising warmth in the cold air. Ezra replaced the medal in its hiding place and walked to the barn, carrying a bucket of warm water and clean rags. The animal allowed him to tend its wounds without resistance, as if recognizing a kindred spirit marked by suffering. "Looks like we're both a long way from where we started," Ezra said quietly. "Question is whether that's far enough." Outside, the wind picked up strength, carrying new sounds that made him pause with sudden alertness. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the storm, he heard what might have been voices calling through the darkness. 3 days of constant care had transformed the dying horse into a creature that could stand without trembling. Ezra watched with satisfaction as the animal moved tentatively around the makeshift stall, testing legs that had carried it through what must have been a desperate flight across treacherous mountain terrain. The morning sun streamed through gaps in the barn walls, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the golden light. Ezra had always found peace in such moments, when the simple act of preserving life reminded him why he'd chosen exile over compromise. But today, curiosity gnawed at him with increasing persistence. The saddlebags hung where he'd placed them that first night, untouched but not forgotten. Their leather bore the distinctive tooling of master craftsmen, with brass fittings that spoke of wealth far beyond what most travelers could afford. More troubling, the bags showed signs of hasty packing, as if someone had fled in great urgency. "Time we learned what brought you to my doorstep," Ezra murmured, approaching the horse with slow, deliberate movements. The animal watched him with intelligent eyes, no longer showing the wild panic of those first desperate hours. His weathered fingers worked the buckles with practiced ease, years of handling military equipment making the unfamiliar straps yield to his touch. The first bag contained what he expected from a wealthy traveler: fine clothes wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound journal filled with neat handwriting, and a small pouch containing more gold coins than Ezra had seen in 20 years. But the second bag held treasures that made his breath catch in his throat. Maps, dozens of them hand-drawn with the precision of professional surveyors. The topographical details matched terrain Ezra recognized from his years in these mountains, but the notations told a story that chilled his blood. Red lines traced proposed railroad routes through valleys he knew were home to Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. Penciled margins contained calculations for timber rights, mineral surveys, and land acquisitions that would require displacing entire communities. Beneath the maps, a bundle of letters bore the official seal of the Denver and Pacific Railroad. The correspondence painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached from local land offices to territorial governors. Harrison Blackwood's name appeared repeatedly, his flowing signature authorizing payments to judges, sheriffs, and federal commissioners who would smooth the railroad's expansion regardless of legal obstacles. One letter made Ezra's hands shake with rage. Dated just 2 weeks earlier, it outlined plans to provoke incidents with local tribes that would justify military intervention. The document specifically mentioned Sand Creek as a successful model for clearing unwanted populations from valuable land. The same massacre that had destroyed Ezra's career was being used as a blueprint for future atrocities. "God Almighty," he whispered, sinking onto a bale of hay as the implications washed over him. "What have you brought me?" The horse moved closer, as if sensing his distress. Its warm breath fogged the cold air between them, and Ezra found himself looking into eyes that seemed to understand the weight of secrets. This animal hadn't wandered into his sanctuary by accident. Someone had sent it here, perhaps the only person who could expose the conspiracy before more innocent blood was shed. At the bottom of the saddlebag, wrapped in oiled silk, lay the most damning evidence of all. A detailed schedule of planned incidents, complete with dates, locations, and the names of tribal leaders marked for elimination. The methodical precision reminded Ezra of military campaign planning, except these targets were women and children, whose only crime was living on land that powerful men wanted to claim. A particular notation made his blood run cold. The schedule included specific references to the stone problem, acknowledging that a former cavalry officer living in the target area possessed knowledge that could complicate their operations. They knew he was here. They knew who he was. And they had already decided he needed to be silenced. The sound of approaching horses reached him through the barn walls, multiple animals moving with the steady rhythm of experienced riders. Ezra quickly stuffed the documents back into the saddlebags, his mind racing through possibilities. Friend or foe, these visitors represented a fundamental change in his carefully maintained isolation. He moved to the small window that faced downslope toward the main trail, staying in shadows that would conceal his presence. 4 riders picked their way up the treacherous path, their movements suggesting military training despite civilian clothes. The leader sat his horse with the rigid posture Ezra recognized from years of serving alongside professional soldiers. These weren't lost travelers seeking shelter from the storm. They were hunters, and they had come for their prey. The horse sensed the approaching danger, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as it tested the wind for familiar scents. Its reaction confirmed what Ezra already suspected. These men had been tracking the animal, following its trail across impossible terrain with the persistence of bounty hunters pursuing valuable quarry. Ezra touched the saddlebags one final time, feeling the weight of secrets that could topple governance and save countless lives. Then he reached for the cavalry saber that hung beside his rifle, the blade singing softly as it cleared its sheath. The memory struck Ezra like a physical blow as he watched the riders approach. Fort Leon, the same methodical advance, the same predatory patience he'd witnessed 21 years ago when Colonel John Chavington had led 700 soldiers toward the sleeping Cheyenne camp at Sand Creek. Ezra had been a different man then, still believing that honor and duty were synonymous, still trusting that his uniform represented something worth dying for. Captain Stone had commanded Company K of the Colorado Territory Volunteers, men who looked to him for leadership and moral guidance. When Chavington ordered the attack on Chief Black Kettle's peaceful village, Ezra had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had refused. The court-martial had been swift and brutal. Chavington's political connections reached all the way to Washington, and a decorated war hero who questioned orders became a liability to be eliminated. The charges were treason, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence was manufactured, the witnesses bought, and the verdict predetermined. But Ezra knew the truth. He had seen the white flags of surrender flying over Black Kettle's lodge. He had counted the women and children who comprised most of the village's population, and when Chavington screamed his orders to kill and scalp all, big and little, Ezra Stone had chosen conscience over career. The price had been everything he valued: his commission, his reputation, and ultimately his freedom. A wanted poster from those dark days still bore his likeness, offering $500 for his capture on charges of desertion and murder. The murder charge was particularly cruel, pinned on him for the death of a sergeant who had tried to stop Ezra from warning the Cheyenne of the impending attack. Now, as he studied the approaching riders through his rifle scope, Ezra recognized the tactical formation Chavington's men had used that terrible morning. History was repeating itself, and once again he found himself standing between innocent lives and those who would destroy them for profit. The lead rider dismounted 50 yards from the cabin, a man whose bearing screamed military training despite his civilian clothes. Even at this distance, Ezra could see the Confederate cavalry saber hanging at his side, the blade's distinctive curve marking him as a former officer of the Southern cause. The irony wasn't lost on Ezra that enemies from both sides of the Great War now found themselves united in the service of corruption. A piece of paper fluttered from the man's coat as he gestured to his companions. Even from his concealed position, Ezra could make out enough detail to recognize what it was. A wanted poster. His wanted poster, somehow preserved across 2 decades of careful hiding. The discovery sent ice through his veins. These weren't just bounty hunters seeking the missing documents. They were collectors of old debts. Men who had somehow connected the hermit of the Colorado mountains with the disgraced cavalry officer who had vanished after Sand Creek. The railroad conspiracy was just the beginning. Someone wanted to finish the job that court-martial had started. The horse moved restlessly in its stall, sensing the tension that filled the barn like smoke. Ezra reached out to calm the animal, noting how its ears remained fixed on the sounds outside. This horse knew these men, feared them enough to tremble despite its recent recovery. Whatever desperate flight had brought it to Ezra's sanctuary had been an escape from the very people now surrounding his home. Through the window he watched the riders spread out in a classic encirclement pattern. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, professionals who understood how to corner prey with minimal risk to themselves. But they were also making assumptions based on hunting ordinary fugitives, not a former cavalry officer who had spent 20 years studying these mountains like a military textbook. The leader called out across the distance between them, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Ezra Stone, we know you're in there. We've come for what belongs to Mr. Blackwood, and we'll be taking you back to face justice for crimes long overdue." Ezra smiled grimly at the familiar words. Justice, the same word Chivington had used to justify butchering 300 peaceful Cheyenne. The same word politicians used when they needed convenient scapegoats for their failures. In his experience, men who talked loudest about justice were usually the ones most eager to pervert it. The horse nickered softly, a sound that somehow conveyed both fear and determination. Ezra found himself wondering about the animal's previous owner, the person brave enough to steal these documents and attempt to expose Blackwood's conspiracy. Whoever they were, they had trusted their most precious cargo to a horse's instinct for survival rather than human judgment. "Smart choice," he murmured, checking his rifle's action one final time. "Horses don't lie to themselves about what needs doing." Jack Morrison had been tracking men for 30 years, ever since the war ended, and left him with skills that peacetime didn't value. The silver compass in his coat pocket had guided him through swamps and deserts, across plains and mountains, always pointing toward the next bounty that would keep food in his belly and whiskey in his flask. But this job was different, personal. He studied the cabin through his field glasses, noting the defensive advantages that any competent soldier would recognize. The building sat in a natural bowl, with limited approaches, backed against granite cliffs that would funnel attackers into killing fields. Whoever had chosen this location understood military tactics, which confirmed what Morrison already suspected about his quarry. "Captain Morrison," his lieutenant called softly. Tom Briggs had served under him during the final campaigns in Virginia, one of the few men who still used his Confederate rank with respect rather than mockery. Johnson spotted fresh tracks leading to that barn. "Big horse, shod recently." Morrison nodded, his weathered face showing satisfaction. 21 years of hunting Ezra Stone had finally led him to this remote sanctuary. The irony was sweet. A Union hero reduced to hiding in the wilderness like a common outlaw, while Morrison had built a reputation as one of the most feared bounty hunters in the Western Territories. The war had ended badly for Morrison. His cavalry regiment had been among the last to surrender, fighting a series of delaying actions that bought precious time for Jefferson Davis's escape attempt. When Appomattox came, Morrison found himself without a country, without a cause, and without any skills that translated to honest work. Bounty hunting had offered a way to continue fighting the war by other means. "Briggs, take Kowalski around to the north side," Morrison ordered, pulling the silver compass from his pocket and checking their bearing. "Stay out of rifle range, but make sure he knows you're there. Wilson, you come with me. We'll take the direct approach." The compass had belonged to his grandfather, a gift passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men who had served in various American wars. His grandfather had carried it through the War of 1812, his father through the Mexican campaigns, and Morrison himself through 4 years of brutal cavalry actions from Bull Run to Five Forks. Now it would guide him to the final victory in his personal war against the Union officer who had escaped justice for too long. Morrison remembered the day he'd first learned about Captain Ezra Stone. A fellow Confederate veteran had brought him a stack of wanted posters, Union deserters who had fled west after various crimes and cowardices. Stone's poster had caught his attention immediately, not because of the reward money but because of what the charges represent. A Union hero who had refused orders, a decorated officer who had chosen conscience over duty. Everything Morrison despised about the Northern cause wrapped up in one convenient target. For 21 years, tracking Stone had been Morrison's private crusade, a way to prove that Confederate honor meant more than Yankee medals. The fact that Harrison Blackwood was paying $10,000 for Stone's capture was simply a bonus. Morrison would have done this job for free. "You sure about this, Captain?" Wilson asked nervously. Joe Wilson was the newest member of Morrison's team, a former Union soldier himself who had turned to bounty hunting after a dishonorable discharge. "Man's been living up here for 20 years. Probably knows every rock and tree." Morrison's hand moved instinctively to the Confederate battle flag, folded in his breast pocket, the same flag his regiment had carried through its final desperate charge at Sailor's Creek. "That's exactly why we're going to take him, Wilson. A man gets comfortable, he gets careless. Stone's been playing hermit for so long he's forgotten what it means to fight." The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something else, something that made Morrison's pulse quicken, with anticipation, fear. Even after all these years, he could smell it on his prey when the final moments approached. Stone knew they were coming. The question was whether the famous Union hero still had the courage to face the reckoning that had been delayed for 2 decades. Morrison pulled out his field glasses again, studying the cabin's windows for signs of movement. A shadow passed behind one of them, too quick to identify, but confirming that their quarry was alert and aware. Good. Morrison had always preferred his prey to know they were being hunted. His tick made the final capture more satisfying. The compass needle swung steadily toward magnetic north, but Morrison's attention focused on a different direction entirely. Justice, delayed but not denied, waited in that humble cabin. Today, finally, the account between Jack Morrison and Ezra Stone would be settled in full. The voice that echoed across the snow-covered clearing carried the distinctive drawl of Georgia, but Ezra would have recognized Jack Morrison's commanding tone even without the accent. Some sounds burned themselves into a soldier's memory, and Morrison's battlefield orders had haunted Ezra's dreams for 21 years. Chancellorsville, May. Captain Morrison's Confederate cavalry had caught Ezra's supply train in open country. A perfectly executed ambush that cost the Union 17 good men and nearly broke Ezra's faith in his own tactical judgment. Morrison had called for surrender then with the same cold confidence he projected now, offering quarter to men who had no choice but to trust their enemy's honor. Morrison had kept his word that day, treating captured Union soldiers with the respect due to worthy opponents. It was one of the ironies that made their current situation so bitter. In war, they had been honorable enemies. In peace, they had become something far more dangerous to each other. "I know you remember me, Stone," Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the distant Chancellorsville. "You were the Union captain who held that ridgeline for 6 hours against impossible odds. I respected you then." Ezra moved carefully to another window, maintaining his concealment while studying Morrison's position. The Confederate had chosen his ground well, placing himself behind a fallen log that provided both cover and a stable shooting rest. Professional to the core, just as he'd been during the war. "That was before Sand Creek," Morrison continued, and Ezra heard the contempt that had replaced respect in the bounty hunter's voice. "Before you showed your true colors by betraying your own country's order." The accusation struck like a physical blow, reopening wounds that 20 years of mountain solitude had barely begun to heal. Ezra's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, not from fear but from rage, at the casual way Morrison perverted the truth. Betraying orders to massacre women and children had been the most honorable thing Ezra Stone had ever done. "You don't know what you're talking about, Morrison," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in life-or-death situations. "You weren't there." Morrison's laughter was harsh as winter wind. "I know enough. Union hero turns coward when the fighting gets dirty, runs away rather than do his duty. 21 years I've been tracking you, Stone, and it all ends today." From the barn, the horse whinnied nervously, sensing the tension that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The sound reminded Ezra that this confrontation was about more than settling old scores between former enemies. Those saddlebags contained evidence that could prevent atrocities far worse than anything that had happened at Sand Creek. "What's Blackwood paying you, Morrison?" Ezra called out. 30 pieces of silver." The reference struck home. Morrison's reply came sharp with anger. "Enough to retire comfortable, more than enough to make this worth my while." Through his rifle scope, Ezra studied the Confederate battle flag that Morrison wore pinned to his coat collar. The fabric was faded but carefully maintained, a symbol of cause and loyalty that had never surrendered despite military defeat. Morrison fought now for money rather than ideology, but he carried his past like a banner. "You used to stand for something," Ezra said quietly. "What would your grandfather think of the man you've become?" The words hit their target with sniper's precision. Morrison's grandfather had been a respected Georgia judge before the war, a man known for his integrity and fierce devotion to Southern principles. That Morrison now served corrupt railroad barons would shame the memory of such ancestors. "Don't you dare speak of my family," Morrison snarled, his professional composure cracking for the first time. "Not after what you did. Not after the disgrace you brought on the uniform." Ezra felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same mental clarity that had carried him through countless cavalry charges during the war. Morrison's anger was a weapon that could be turned against him, a weakness to exploit when the shooting started. And it would start soon. Men like Morrison didn't travel hundreds of miles just to have conversations. The horse moved restlessly in its stall, and Ezra realized the animal was reacting to something his human senses hadn't yet detected. A slight shift in the wind brought new sounds, the careful movement of men positioning themselves for attack. Morrison's conversation had been a distraction, keeping Ezra focused forward while his companions completed their encirclement. "Last chance, Stone," Morrison called out. "Surrender now, and I'll see you get a fair trial. Keep fighting and I'll bring you in draped over a saddle." Ezra touched the cavalry saber at his side, feeling the familiar weight of steel that had saved his life more times than he could count. Some fights couldn't be avoided, only won or lost, and this fight had been brewing for 21 years. 20 miles down the mountain in the town of Cedar Falls, Sarah Matthews bent over the telegraph key with the focused concentration of someone whose job had become far more dangerous than sending weather reports and grain prices. The brass key clicked rapidly under her practiced fingers, each tap carrying messages that could mean the difference between life and death for people she had never met. At 32, Sarah had operated the town's telegraph office for 8 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident that left her with bills to pay and no other marketable skills. The work was steady, if not exciting, connecting their small community to the wider world through dots and dashes that spelled out news, business, and the occasional personal message. But 3 months ago, everything had changed. She had been working late, transcribing a particularly long message about cattle prices, when another telegram came through on the priority line reserved for official business. The sender identification marked it as coming from Harrison Blackwood's Denver office, but the routing showed it was meant for Deputy Sheriff Collins rather than the main telegraph office. Sarah's training told her to simply forward the message without reading its contents. Her curiosity, however, had gotten the better of her. What she read in that first intercepted telegram had opened her eyes to a conspiracy that reached far beyond their quiet mountain community. Since then, she had been carefully monitoring communications between Blackwood's organization and their local agents. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic corruption involving land grabs, fraudulent surveys, and planned violence against native tribes. Most disturbing of all, she had learned that several townspeople she had known for years were secretly working for the railroad baron. Deputy Sheriff Collins was the worst of them. The man who arrested drunks and settled property disputes was also coordinating with hired killers and falsifying official reports that would justify military intervention against peaceful tribes. Sarah had watched him transform from a slightly corrupt small-town lawman into something far more sinister. The telegraph key began clicking again, interrupting her troubled thoughts. Sarah's practiced ear recognized the rhythm immediately. Emergency priority. Routing code that indicated the message came directly from Blackwood himself. She began transcribing automatically, her pencil moving across the page even as her blood ran cold at what she was recording. To Morrison, stop stone located, Cedar Falls area. Stop eliminate with extreme prejudice. Stop recover documents at all costs. Stop authorized payment. $50,000. Completion. Stop Blackwood. $50,000, more money than most people in Cedar Falls would see in their entire lifetimes. And it was payment for murder, pure and simple. Sarah's hands shook as she realized that someone named Stone was about to become the target of professional killers, and there was nothing she could do to warn him through official channels. The door opened behind her, letting in a gust of cold air along with Deputy Collins. Sarah quickly slipped the transcribed message under a stack of routine correspondence, trying to maintain the casual demeanor that had kept her alive through 3 months of dangerous eavesdropping. Afternoon, Sarah. Collins said, his tone carrying the false friendliness that made her skin crawl. Any messages for me today? She handed him 3 routine communications, keeping her expression neutral despite the knowledge of what he really was. Collins read through them quickly, his disappointment obvious when he found nothing from his criminal contacts. Quiet day, he observed, settling into the chair that visitors used when waiting for replies to their telegrams. Sometimes I think this town's too peaceful for its own good. Sarah continued working on legitimate messages, using the familiar rhythm of the telegraph key to calm her nerves. Collins made her nervous under the best of circumstances, but knowing he was part of Blackwood's conspiracy made his presence genuinely frightening. You hear anything about strangers in the area? Collins asked casually. Maybe someone asking questions about old-timers who've been living up in the mountains? The question confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Collins was fishing for information about this Stone person, trying to determine how much the locals might know about Blackwood's target. She needed to be very careful with her answer. Haven't heard anything like that, she replied truthfully. Most folks don't venture far into the high country this time of year. Too dangerous with the weather turning. Collins nodded, apparently satisfied. Well, if you do hear anything unusual, you let me know right away. Could be important for the town's safety. After he left, Sarah sat staring at the hidden message until the words blurred together. $50,000 for a man's life. She had no idea who Stone was or why Blackwood wanted him dead, but she couldn't stand by and let murder happen without at least trying to prevent it. The telegraph key sat silent before her, waiting for her decision. The first shot shattered the morning silence, like breaking glass. Morrison's rifle bullet splintering the cabin's doorframe, 6 inches from Ezra's head. 21 years of mountain living had kept his reflexes sharp, and he dropped to the floor before the sound finished echoing off the surrounding cliffs. So much for surrender, Ezra muttered, crawling toward the window that offered the best field of fire down the slope. His cavalry saber sang softly as he pulled it from its sheath. The familiar weight, bringing back muscle memories from 100 cavalry charges. The saber had been forged in Springfield, Massachusetts, in 1859, its blade carrying the maker's mark of one of America's finest swordsmiths. Ezra had carried it through 3 years of war, from Bull Run to Appomattox, and it had saved his life more times than he could count. The steel held an edge that could split silk or cleave bone, depending on what the moment required. A second shot punched through the cabin's wall, sending splinters of pine flying across the room. Morrison's men were testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses, while keeping him pinned down. Professional work, the kind Ezra had learned to respect even when it was directed against him. Through the window he spotted movement behind a snow-covered boulder. Tom Briggs, if Ezra's memory served correctly. Morrison's lieutenant had always been methodical in his approach to combat, preferring careful positioning to reckless charges. That patience made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Ezra's rifle spoke once, the tight 45-70 cartridge sending 500 grains of lead into the boulder with enough force to shower Briggs with granite fragments. The return fire came immediately, 3 rapid shots that forced Ezra away from the window. They were trying to keep him occupied while someone moved to a better position. The horse whinnied nervously from the barn, and Ezra realized Morrison's men might try to use the animal as leverage. The documents in those saddlebags were worth more than one old soldier's life, but Morrison wouldn't hesitate to threaten the horse if it served his purposes. A shadow passed the north window, too quick to target, but close enough to confirm Ezra's tactical assessment. They were surrounding the cabin, cutting off his escape routes, while maintaining constant pressure. Standard cavalry tactics, the kind both sides had perfected during the war. Ezra's mind raced through his options, calculating angles and distances with the precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of brutal campaigning. The cabin's thick log walls would stop rifle bullets, but they also limited his fields of fire. He needed to break Morrison's rhythm, disrupt their careful planning before they completed their encirclement. The saber's blade caught the morning light as he moved toward the back door, its polished steel reflecting memories of charges at Brandy Station and Cedar Creek. In those battles, speed had been everything. Cavalry lived by momentum, striking hard and fast before the enemy could organize effective resistance. Ezra threw open the door and erupted from the cabin like a man possessed, the saber held high as he charged toward the nearest attacker. Wilson, the nervous newcomer to Morrison's team, had been moving toward the barn when Ezra appeared. The bounty hunter's rifle was pointed in the wrong direction, and his experience didn't include facing cavalry charges on foot. The saber took Wilson in the shoulder, slicing through coat and flesh with surgical precision. Wilson screamed and dropped his rifle, stumbling backward into the snow as blood spread across his shirt. Ezra reversed his grip and brought the pommel down on Wilson's temple, dropping him unconscious into a snowdrift. "Stone," Morrison's voice carried rage and grudging admiration. "That was always your weakness. Too honorable to kill when you had the chance." Ezra scooped up Wilson's rifle and dove behind the barn as shots rang out from 3 directions. Morrison was right about his reluctance to kill, but wrong about it being a weakness. In Ezra's experience, men who killed unnecessarily usually ended up dead themselves. Honor wasn't a luxury in combat. It was a survival strategy. The horse pressed against the barn wall, seeking comfort from its human protector. Ezra reached out to calm the animal, noting how its ears tracked the sounds of approaching footsteps. This horse had been trained for combat, probably by cavalry officers who understood the partnership between rider and mount that made mounted warfare possible. "Easy, friend," Ezra whispered. "We're not finished yet." Morrison's voice echoed across the clearing, cold with professional respect. "2 men down, Stone. But you're still outnumbered, and we both know how this ends." Ezra checked Wilson's rifle, finding it fully loaded and well-maintained. The unconscious bounty hunter would live, probably with nothing worse than a scar to remind him of the day he learned the difference between hunting ordinary fugitives and facing a veteran cavalry officer. "The day's still young, Morrison," Ezra called back, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had survived worse odds than these. The arrow struck the tree beside Morrison's head with enough force to bury its iron point 3 inches deep in seasoned pine. The bounty hunter spun toward the new threat, his rifle swinging in a wide arc as he searched for targets among the snow-laden branches. From the forest came the sound of approaching horses, unshod hooves moving with the fluid rhythm of riders who had learned their skills on the Great Plains rather than in European riding schools. Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the tactical situation developing around his position. "Cheyenne," Briggs whispered, his voice tight with the fear that every white man in Colorado Territory learned to respect. "How many?" Before Morrison could answer, a voice spoke from the tree line, words delivered in accented but clear English. "Enough." Chief Running Bear emerged from the forest with the quiet dignity of a man who commanded through respect rather than fear. At 63, the Cheyenne leader carried his years like a badge of honor, his weathered face telling the story of a people who had survived everything the white world could throw at them. Behind him rode 12 warriors, their faces painted for battle, but their weapons held in positions that spoke of readiness rather than immediate attack. These were not the desperate raiders that Eastern newspapers loved to sensationalize. They were professional soldiers defending their homeland against invaders. Ezra stepped out from behind the barn, his saber still drawn but pointed toward the ground in a gesture of respect. "Running Bear, I didn't expect to see you this far south." The chief's weathered features showed surprise at being recognized, then something that might have been approval. "Stone who speaks truth. We heard gunfire, came to see who disturbs the winter peace." Morrison's rifle remained trained on the Native Americans, though his tactical situation had become impossible. Caught between Ezra's position and Running Bear's warriors, his men were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Professional bounty hunters learned to recognize when the odds had shifted beyond recovery. "This is federal business," Morrison called out, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These men are fugitives from justice." Running Bear's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter knowledge of a man who had heard such claims too many times. "Federal justice. Like Sand Creek was federal justice." The words struck Morrison like physical blows, connecting the current situation to the massacre that had made heroes into villains and villains into heroes. Running Bear had been at Sand Creek, one of the few survivors of Chivington's attack. His presence here was no coincidence. "You know what happened there?" Ezra asked quietly. "I was 17 winters old," Running Bear replied, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "I saw blue soldiers kill women and children while they slept under white flags. I saw one officer try to stop the killing. That officer had eyes like yours, stone who speaks truth." Ezra felt the weight of recognition settle between them like a bridge spanning 21 years of exile and shame. Running Bear had been there that terrible morning, had witnessed Ezra's desperate attempt to prevent the massacre that destroyed his career and drove him into the wilderness. "The documents in that horse's saddlebags," Ezra said carefully. "They contain plans for another Sand Creek. Different location, same result." Running Bear's expression hardened into something that would have made Morrison's blood freeze if the bounty hunter had possessed enough wisdom to recognize death when it looked at him. The chief spoke quietly to his warriors in their own language, words that caused hands to shift toward weapons with practiced efficiency. "My people have been moved 4 times in 20 years, Running Bear said, returning his attention to Ezra. "Each time the white government promises the new reservation will be permanent. Each time they find reasons to move us again when our land becomes valuable." From his coat, Running Bear produced a small leather pouch decorated with traditional beadwork. The medicine pouch had been crafted by skilled hands, its geometric patterns telling stories that reached back through generations of tribal memory. He extended it toward Ezra with the solemnity of a man offering a sacred gift. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Running Bear explained. "It carries the protection of warriors who died defending our people. I offer it to Stone who speaks truth, who tried to defend our people when his own kind would not." Ezra accepted the pouch with the reverence it deserved, understanding that this gesture represented more than personal gratitude. Running Bear was forging an alliance, linking their shared enemy and their complementary skills in a partnership that might prevent future atrocities. Morrison's voice cracked with desperation as he realized the implications of what he was witnessing. "You can't trust them, Stone. They're savages. They'll turn on you the moment it suits their purpose." Running Bear's reply carried the quiet authority of a man who had earned his wisdom through suffering. "We keep our promises, bounty hunter. It is white men who speak with forked tongues. In his mahogany-paneled office overlooking Denver's bustling business district, Harrison Blackwood pulled the gold pocket watch from his vest and checked the time with the precision of a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. 4:30 in the afternoon meant Morrison should have completed his mission hours ago. The silence from the mountains was becoming troublesome. At 55, Blackwood had built his railroad empire through a combination of vision, ruthlessness, and an absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with business decisions. The Denver and Pacific Railroad represented more than transportation infrastructure. It was a machine for transforming wilderness into wealth, converting useless mountains and prairies into assets that could be bought, sold, and developed according to market demands. The documents stolen from his private safe represented 20 years of careful planning, detailed surveys that identified every valuable resource from Colorado to California. More importantly, they contained the legal framework for acquiring those resources, regardless of existing claims or inconvenient populations. Treaties could be renegotiated, surveys could be adjusted, and native tribes could be relocated or eliminated as circumstances required. A soft knock interrupted his calculations. "Come," he called, not looking up from the territorial maps spread across his desk. His secretary, a nervous man named Peters, entered carrying a leather portfolio. "Sir, the evening reports from our field supervisor. Also a telegram from the territorial governor's office." Blackwood accepted the documents with the casual authority of a man accustomed to having his smallest wishes anticipated and fulfilled. The governor's telegram contained the expected platitudes about cooperation between private enterprise and territorial development. But the field reports told a more concerning story. 3 separate survey crews had reported encounters with hostile Indians in areas that were supposed to be clear of native populations. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes were becoming increasingly organized in their resistance to railroad expansion, and their knowledge of local terrain gave them significant tactical advantages over company security forces. "Sir," Peters ventured carefully, "should I prepare a response to the governor?" "Not yet," Blackwood replied, his attention focused on a detailed survey of the mountain region where Morrison was hunting Ezra Stone. The area contained significant mineral deposits, timber resources, and water rights that would be essential for the railroad's expansion through the Colorado Rockies. More importantly, it sat astride the most practical route for connecting Denver to the Pacific Coast markets that would make him one of the richest men in America. The gold pocket watch had belonged to his father, a Connecticut industrialist who had built his fortune supplying uniforms and equipment to Union forces during the Civil War. The elder Blackwood had taught his son that sentiment was a luxury that successful men could not afford, and that every human interaction should be evaluated in terms of costs and benefits. "Peters," Blackwood said finally, "send a message to Captain Morrison through our usual channels. Tell him that his timeline has been moved up. I want this matter resolved within 24 hours. And if he doesn't respond, sir?" Blackwood's smile held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. "Then we implement the alternative plan. Alert Colonel Chivington that his services may be required again." The mention of Chivington's name made Peters visibly uncomfortable, though he was careful not to let his reaction show. Everyone in Blackwood's organization knew about the special arrangement with the former military officer, the understanding that certain problems required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of conventional law. After Peters left, Blackwood returned his attention to the maps, tracing railroad routes with his finger while calculating the wealth that each mile of track would generate. The Cheyenne reservations marked on the official territorial surveys were merely temporary inconveniences, obstacles to be removed when the time was right. The massacre at Sand Creek had demonstrated how quickly such obstacles could be eliminated when proper pressure was applied to the right officials. The stolen documents represented more than embarrassing correspondence. They contained the complete blueprint for transforming the American West from a collection of worthless wilderness areas into a profitable network of mines, ranches and railroad towns. Every native tribe, every independent homesteader, every small rancher who stood in the way of that vision would be swept aside by the inexorable forces of progress and profit. Blackwood pulled out a fresh sheet of letterhead and began composing orders that would mobilize resources across 3 territories. Stone's interference had already cost valuable time, and delays meant opportunities for competitors to establish claims in areas that Blackwood considered his exclusive domain. The mountain hermit would learn that challenging the Denver and Pacific Railroad carried consequences far beyond anything one man could handle. The gold watch ticked steadily in the office silence, marking time that was running out for everyone who stood between Harrison Blackwood and his destiny as the railroad king of the American West. The bundle of dynamite sticks lay arranged on Ezra's workbench like sleeping serpents, their waxy coating gleaming dully in the lamplight. 24 sticks of pure destruction, each one capable of moving boulders or bringing down trees. Together, they represented enough explosive power to reshape the landscape according to his tactical needs. Ezra's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared the charges, muscle memory from his engineering training taking over. Despite the 20 years that had passed since he last handled military explosives, the Union Army had taught him that destruction could be just as important as construction, that sometimes the only way to protect innocent lives was to eliminate the threats that endangered them. Running Bear watched the process with quiet interest, his weathered features showing respect for skills that transcended the boundaries between cultures. "You learned this in the war." "Sappers and miners," Ezra confirmed, carefully inserting blasting caps into the dynamite with movements that brooked no carelessness. "Sometimes we had to bring down bridges to slow Confederate advances. Sometimes we had to clear obstacles for our own troops." The Cheyenne chief nodded understanding. His own people had learned similar lessons about using the land itself as a weapon, turning familiar terrain into a maze of deadly surprises for invading forces. The difference was that Running Bear's warriors used arrows and tomahawks while Ezra employed manufactured explosives, but the underlying principles remained the same. "The railroad men will bring more soldiers," Running Bear observed, settling onto a stool beside the workbench. "They have done this before after Sand Creek. Promise protection, then create reasons for war." Ezra's jaw tightened at the reminder of how quickly political situations could be manipulated to justify atrocities. Chivington had used a few isolated incidents to convince territorial officials that a full-scale military response was necessary, turning minor conflicts into pretexts for genocide. Blackwood's organization would employ the same tactics if given the opportunity. "That's why we need to strike first," Ezra said, connecting lengths of fuse with the methodical care that separated professionals from amateurs. "Hit them hard enough to disrupt their plans before they can organize a proper response." The horse moved restlessly in its stall, ears pricked forward as it sensed the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. The animal had recovered its strength over the past week, but its nervous energy suggested it understood that another dangerous journey lay ahead. Ezra had been training it for warfare, teaching it to respond to leg pressure and weight shifts that would leave his hands free for weapons. Running Bear's warriors had been equally busy, scouting railroad camps and surveying supply lines with the thoroughness that had made them legendary among white military commanders. Their reports painted a picture of an organization that was powerful but overextended, dependent on predictable routines that could be exploited by opponents who understood guerrilla tactics. "The supply depot at Willow Creek," Running Bear said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the workbench. 20 guards, but they rotate shifts at the same times every day. "Hit them at dawn, when the night watch is tired and the day watch hasn't fully awakened." Ezra studied the map, noting the defensive positions and escape routes that Running Bear's scouts had identified. The depot contained enough supplies to support Blackwood's operations for months. But more importantly, it housed the surveying equipment and legal documents that the railroad used to establish land claims. Destroying those resources would force Blackwood to rebuild his entire administrative infrastructure from scratch. "What about civilians?" Ezra asked. The depot employed local men as laborers and guards, People who probably had no idea they were supporting a criminal conspiracy. "We give them a chance to leave," Running Bear replied. "Send a message the night before, tell them to find other employment. Those who choose to stay have made their decision." The approach was more merciful than anything Chivington had offered the Cheyenne at Sand Creek, but Ezra still felt the weight of responsibility for lives that might be lost in the coming battle. 20 years of mountain solitude had not erased his understanding that every tactical decision carried moral consequences. "The documents we recovered from your horse," Running Bear continued. "They show 3 other locations where the railroad plans to provoke incidents with my people. Stop them at Willow Creek, and we save hundreds of lives." Ezra nodded, completing the final connections on his improvised explosives. The charges were ready, each one carefully calibrated to maximize destruction while minimizing the risk of accidental detonation. Now all they needed was the courage to use them against an enemy that commanded resources far beyond anything 24 warriors could match in conventional warfare. "Your grandfather's medicine pouch," Ezra said, touching the leather bag that Running Bear had given him. "Does it really carry protection?" The chief's smile held depths of wisdom earned through decades of survival against impossible odds. "It carries the spirits of warriors who never surrendered. That is protection enough." The trap closed with the precision of a steel snare. 20 years of mountain warfare experience condensed into a few minutes of calculated violence that would have made his old cavalry instructors proud. Morrison's remaining men never saw the avalanche coming until thousands of tons of snow and rock thundered down the mountainside, triggered by Ezra's carefully placed dynamite charges. From his concealed position behind a granite outcrop, Ezra watched the White Death sweep away the bounty hunters' horses and equipment, transforming the narrow valley into an impassable maze of debris. Morrison himself dove behind a boulder, just in time to avoid being crushed. But his tactical position had been reduced from hunter to hunted in the span of a heartbeat. The broken chain that had once secured the dynamite to Ezra's pack lay twisted in the snow, its severed links catching the morning sunlight like scattered coins. For 21 years that chain had bound him to his past, connecting his exile to the shame of Sand Creek and the weight of decisions that had destroyed his faith in justice. Breaking it to free the explosives felt like breaking free from the guilt that had defined his existence since the court-martial. Running Bear's warriors materialized from the forest like spirits made flesh, their war paint and traditional weapons creating a scene that belonged to an earlier, more honest age of warfare. They moved with the fluid coordination of men who had trained together since childhood, each warrior knowing his role in the complex dance of combat that was about to unfold. "Morrison," Ezra called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with the authority of a man who had commanded troops in life-or-death situations. "Your men are finished. Surrender now and you'll live to face a fair trial." The bounty hunter's reply came from behind his makeshift fortification, bitter laughter that carried no humor. "Fair trial? From the man who betrayed his own country? I'd rather die fighting than trust Yankee justice." Morrison's Confederate battle flag fluttered from his coat as he rose to fire at Running Bear's approaching warriors, the faded fabric a symbol of causes that had died at Appomattox but lived on in the hearts of men who could not accept defeat. His rifle spoke twice, forcing 2 Cheyenne warriors to seek cover, but his ammunition was limited and his position hopeless. "You still don't understand," Ezra replied, working his way closer through the avalanche debris. Sand Creek wasn't about north versus south. It was about right versus wrong. Some things transcend politics, Morrison. A Cheyenne warrior called Broken Lance had flanked Morrison's position, moving with the silent efficiency that had made his people legendary fighters on the Great Plains. His tomahawk gleamed as he prepared to strike, but Running Bear's sharp command stopped him, just short of delivering the killing blow. "Stone who speaks truth wants him alive," Running Bear explained in English, ensuring that both Morrison and Ezra understood the decision. "We honor our allies' wishes. Morrison's face showed the confusion of a man whose worldview could not accommodate the idea of Native Americans showing mercy to their enemies. His experience with Western tribes had been shaped by sensationalized newspaper accounts and military propaganda that painted all Indians as bloodthirsty savages, incapable of civilized behavior. "You're making a mistake," Morrison gasped, as Broken Lance disarmed him with efficient brutality. "These people will turn on you the moment it serves their interests. They can't be trusted." Running Bear's weathered features showed the patience of a man who had heard such accusations for most of his life. "We have kept every treaty we ever signed with white men. It is your people who break their promises when land becomes valuable." Ezra retrieved Morrison's rifle and ammunition, noting the superior craftsmanship that marked it as a custom weapon built for a professional hunter. The bounty hunter had spared no expense in equipping himself for this mission, which suggested that Blackwood's payment had been substantial enough to justify significant investment. "The railroad baron who hired you," Ezra said, checking Morrison's bonds to ensure they were secure, but not cruel. "How many more men does he have?" Morrison's smile held the cold satisfaction of a man who knew his defeat was only the beginning of his enemy's troubles. "Enough to finish what I started. You killed some of my boys, Stone, but Blackwood has resources you can't even imagine. He'll send an army if that's what it takes." The warning carried the ring of truth that made Ezra's blood run cold. Morrison was a professional, not given to empty threats or desperate bluffing. If he believed Blackwood could field an army against them, then the railroad baron's resources were even more extensive than the stolen documents had suggested. "Then we'd better make sure those documents reach the right people before his army arrives," Ezra replied. Federal Marshal Thomas Kane wore his badge like armor, the silver star gleaming against his black coat as he rode into Cedar Falls with the authority of the United States government behind him. At 45, Kane had built his reputation on bringing order to lawless territories, his methods sometimes questionable, but his results undeniable. Sarah Matthews watched his arrival through the telegraph office window, her stomach churning with dread, as she recognized the trap that was closing around everyone who had tried to help Ezra Stone. Kane's presence meant that Blackwood's influence reached all the way to Washington, that corruption had infected the very institutions meant to protect innocent citizens from men like the railroad baron. "Miss Matthews," Kane said as he entered the telegraph office, his voice carrying the false courtesy that predators use to put their prey at ease. "I understand you've been handling communications for this district. I'll need to review your message logs for the past month." The request sounded official and reasonable, exactly the kind of cooperation that federal marshals could demand from local officials. But Sarah knew that Kane was really searching for evidence of her interference in Blackwood's operations, looking for proof that she had been intercepting and reading confidential communication. "Of course, Marshal," she replied, maintaining the submissive demeanor that had kept her alive through months of dangerous eavesdropping. "Though I should mention that most of our traffic is routine business correspondence and weather reports." Kane's smile never reached his eyes as he began sorting through the carefully maintained records that Sarah had prepared for exactly this situation. The legitimate messages told a boring story of grain prices, cattle sales, and family news that would satisfy a cursory inspection. The incriminating communications were hidden in places that only the most thorough search would uncover. "I'm particularly interested in any messages involving a man named Ezra Stone," Kane said casually, though Sarah detected the sharp interest that focused his attention. "There are federal warrants outstanding for his arrest, and we have reason to believe he's been operating in this area." Sarah's training as a telegraph operator had taught her to recognize deception in the rhythm and timing of transmitted messages. The same skills applied to reading human behavior, and Kane's body language screamed danger despite his official credentials. He was hunting, not investigating. "That name doesn't sound familiar," she replied truthfully, "but I could check the records more thoroughly if you'd like." Kane nodded, settling into the chair that visitors used when waiting for replies to their telegrams. His presence filled the small office like smoke, making the air thick with unspoken threats and barely controlled violence. Sarah continued working on routine messages, using the familiar rhythm of the telegraph key to calm her nerves, while Kane pretended to read through her files. Interesting, Kane observed, holding up a message that Sarah recognized with growing horror. This telegram mentions unusual activity in the mountain regions. Gunfire, strangers, asking questions, the kind of disturbances that might indicate fugitive activity. The message had been sent by Deputy Collins 3 days earlier, reporting Morrison's expedition to Blackwood's organization. Sarah had transcribed it mechanically, not realizing it would later be used as evidence against the people she was trying to protect. Sheriff Collins was concerned about potential trouble, she said carefully. We don't get many strangers this time of year, so any unusual activity tends to worry people. Kane's federal marshal badge caught the afternoon light. As he leaned forward, his expression shifting from false courtesy to naked intimidation. Miss Matthews, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Have you been interfering with official communications? The question hung in the office air like a blade poised to fall. Sarah understood that her answer would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the lives of everyone who had become involved in opposing Blackwood's conspiracy. Kane already knew the truth. He was simply giving her a chance to confess before he destroyed her. Marshal, she replied, meeting his gaze with the steadiness of a woman who had already made her choice. I've been doing my job according to the training I received from the Territorial Telegraph Service. Nothing more, nothing less. Kane's hand moved to rest on the butt of his revolver, a gesture that might have appeared casual to an observer, but carried unmistakable meaning for Sarah. You know, Miss Matthews, interfering with federal communications is a very serious crime, the kind that can result in lengthy prison sentences for people who get caught. Outside the telegraph office window, Deputy Collins was approaching with 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, their movements coordinated in the way that suggested careful planning. The trap was closing, and she was running out of time to warn anyone about what was coming. Perhaps, Kane continued, you'd like to reconsider your answer. William Hayes adjusted the focus on his camera with the meticulous care of a man whose livelihood depended on capturing truth through the alchemy of silver and light. The photographer had spent 3 days reaching Ezra's mountain sanctuary, his pack mule loaded with the glass plates and chemical equipment necessary to document evidence that would expose Blackwood's conspiracy to the world. Hold still, Hayes instructed, his voice muffled by the black cloth that covered his head as he peered through the camera's ground glass viewfinder. This needs to be absolutely clear if it's going to convince a federal judge. Ezra stood beside the open saddlebags, the stolen documents spread across a makeshift table in the morning sunlight. Each map and letter was positioned to show its contents, while remaining legible in the photograph, creating a visual record that would be harder to dismiss than testimony alone. The camera itself was a marvel of precision engineering, its brass fittings and mahogany body representing the pinnacle of photographic technology. Hayes had invested everything he owned in the equipment, betting his future on the belief that photographs would become the ultimate form of evidence in criminal trials. Got it, Hayes announced, triggering the shutter mechanism that would capture the scene on a glass plate coated with light-sensitive chemicals. Now let's get some shots of the individual documents, especially that letter from Blackwood authorizing payments to territorial officials. Running Bear watched the photographic process with fascination, his weathered features showing the intense curiosity of a man encountering advanced technology for the first time. These images will speak truth, even when men lie. That's the theory, Hayes replied, carefully removing the exposed plate and sliding it into a protective case. Hard to argue with a photograph, especially when it shows signatures and official seal. The race against time had consumed the past 2 days as word reached them that Marshal Kane had arrived in Cedar Falls with authority to arrest anyone connected to the stolen documents. Sarah's warning had come through Running Bear's scouts, delivered by a young warrior who had observed the federal marshal's arrival from concealment. Ezra studied the list of names and locations that the documents revealed, memorizing details that might prove crucial if the photographic evidence was lost or destroyed. Blackwood's conspiracy reached into territorial governments, federal land offices, and military commands across the Western Territories. Stopping him would require more than exposing his crimes to local authorities. We need to get these photographs to Judge Bradley in Denver, Ezra said, referring to the one federal judge whose reputation for honesty had survived 2 decades of territorial politics. He's got the authority to issue arrest warrants that even Blackwood can't buy his way out of. Hayes packed his equipment with practiced efficiency, each piece of delicate gear secured against the rough handling that mountain travel would require. The glass plates containing the photographic evidence were wrapped in layers of padding that would protect them from everything except direct impact. "The judge is in Colorado Springs this week," Hayes reported, consulting a well-worn notebook that contained his contacts throughout the territory, presiding over a case involving mining claims. "If we can reach him before Kane realizes what we're doing, we might have a chance." The horse that had started this entire adventure stood ready for another desperate journey, its recovery complete, and its loyalty to Ezra beyond question. The animal seemed to understand that its mission was not finished, that the documents it had carried through death and danger still needed to reach their destination. Running Bear approached with a small bundle wrapped in traditional cloth, his expression grave with the weight of what he was about to entrust to strangers. "This contains proof of the surveys on our reservation lands, documents that show the railroad's illegal claims. If something happens to us, make sure Judge Bradley sees these as well." The bundle contained more than legal documents. It held the hopes of a people who had been repeatedly betrayed by white officials, who had watched their children die from starvation and disease, while their ancestral lands were stolen through fraudulent treaties and manufactured conflicts. "I understand," Ezra replied, accepting the responsibility that Running Bear was placing on his shoulders. "Whatever it takes." Hayes mounted his horse with the awkward movements of a man more comfortable behind a camera than in a saddle. But his determination was evident in the set of his shoulders. "We've got maybe 6 hours before Kane realizes we're gone. After that, he'll have every bounty hunter and federal agent in the territory looking for us." Morrison's final warning echoed in Ezra's mind as they prepared to leave the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 20 years. Blackwood's resources were vast, his influence reaching into institutions that should have been beyond corruption's reach. But sometimes, Ezra reflected, the truth carried its own power, especially when captured in silver and light by men brave enough to risk everything for justice. Devil's Canyon earned its name from the treacherous rock formations that jutted from its walls like the teeth of some primordial beast, creating a narrow passage where sound echoed strangely and shadows moved with lives of their own. Ezra had chosen this location for the final confrontation because it offered tactical advantages that would neutralize Morrison's superior numbers, but as he watched the bounty hunters' remaining forces take positions among the rocks, he wondered if he had trapped himself as effectively as his enemies. The original land deed that Running Bear had entrusted to him rested in his coat pocket, its faded ink and official seals representing the legal foundation of Cheyenne. Claims to thousands of acres that Blackwood wanted to steal. The document predated the railroad baron's fraudulent surveys by 40 years, signed by territorial officials whose signatures could still be verified against government records. Morrison appeared at the canyon's mouth like a figure from a fever dream, his Confederate battle flag now torn and stained with the blood of men who had died following his orders. The bounty hunter moved with the careful precision of a wounded animal that remained dangerous despite its injuries, his rifle held with the steady grip of a marksman who had never missed when killing mattered. "Last chance, Stone," Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with supernatural resonance. "Surrender now and I'll make sure you live long enough to see a trial. Keep fighting and I'll put you down like a rabid dog." Ezra checked his cavalry saber one final time, the blade singing softly as it cleared its sheath. The weapon had saved his life in a dozen cavalry charges during the war, its steel forged in the fires of American industry and tempered by the blood of men who had died believing in causes larger than themselves. "You still don't understand, Morrison," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in situations where leadership meant the difference between victory and massacre. "This isn't about the war anymore. It's about preventing another Sand Creek." Morrison's laugh held the bitter satisfaction of a man whose worldview had been validated by 20 years of hunting human prey. "Sand Creek was justice, Stone. Chivington understood what you never could." Sometimes civilization requires hard choices. So words triggered memories that Ezra had spent 2 decades trying to forget. The screams of women and children, the smell of burning lodges, the sight of soldiers scalping victims whose only crime had been trusting in white flags and treaty promises. His refusal to participate had cost him everything he valued, but it had also preserved something in his soul that men like Morrison could never understand. Running Bear's voice reached them from the canyon rim, where Cheyenne warriors had positioned themselves to provide supporting fire. The spirits of Sand Creek watch this fight, stone who speaks truth. They wait for justice. Morrison spun toward the new threat, his tactical situation suddenly complicated by the realization that he was caught in a crossfire between opponents who understood the terrain far better than his urban hunters. The bounty hunter's face showed the first signs of doubt as he calculated odds that no longer favored his survival. "You made an alliance with savages," Morrison snarled, his rifle swinging between targets as he tried to cover multiple approaches simultaneously. "What would your Union comrades think of that betrayal?" "They'd think I finally learned the difference between civilization and barbarism," Ezra replied, advancing through the narrow canyon with the methodical pace of a man who had accepted the necessity of violence. "The same lesson you never could master." Morrison's final shot echoed through Devil's Canyon like thunder, the bullet striking stone inches from Ezra's head and showering him with granite fragments. But the bounty hunter's position had been compromised by muzzle flash, and Running Bear's warriors responded with a flight of arrows that forced him to abandon his cover. Ezra closed the distance with the fluid grace of a cavalry officer leading a mounted charge, his saber reflecting sunlight as it descended toward Morrison's desperate parry. Steel rang against steel in the narrow space between life and death. 21 years of hatred and misunderstanding distilled into a few seconds of brutal combat. The Confederate battle flag fluttered to the ground as Morrison fell, his blood staining the fabric that had represented his last connection to a cause that had died at Appomattox. In his final moments, the bounty hunter's eyes showed something that might have been understanding, the recognition that some fights transcended personal animosity. "Tell Blackwood," Morrison whispered, his voice fading like wind through canyon stones, "that some debts can't be collected." Judge William Bradley's gavel struck the polished oak bench with the finality of divine judgment, its sharp crack echoing through the Colorado Springs courthouse, like a gunshot that would be heard across 3 territories. At 62, Bradley had earned his reputation as one of the few federal judges whose integrity remained untainted by the corruption that infected territorial politics like a plague. "Harrison Blackwood," the judge intoned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against the United States government, and incitement to commit acts of violence against Native American tribes under federal protection." The railroad baron sat in the defendant's chair with the rigid posture of a man whose world had collapsed around him in the span of 48 hours. Blackwood's expensive suit and gold pocket watch marked him as a member of the territorial elite, but the federal marshals flanking his position told a different story about his current circumstances. William Hayes's photographs lay spread across the prosecution table like an accusation, written in silver and light, each glass plate containing evidence that made denial impossible. The images showed documents in Blackwood's own handwriting, letters bearing his signature authorizing payments to corrupt officials, and maps detailing plans to provoke incidents that would justify military intervention against peaceful tribes. "Your Honor," the territorial prosecutor began, holding up one of the photographs that showed Blackwood's correspondence with territorial officials. "These images were taken from documents recovered from the defendant's own private safe. They detail a conspiracy that reaches from Colorado to California, involving the systematic theft of native lands through fraudulent surveys and manufactured conflicts." Judge Bradley examined each photograph with the methodical precision of a man who understood that his decisions would affect thousands of innocent lives. The evidence was overwhelming, too detailed and comprehensive to be dismissed as fabrication or political maneuvering. Ezra sat in the gallery beside Running Bear, watching justice unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had risked everything to reach this moment. The Cheyenne chief's weathered features showed no emotion, but Ezra could sense the profound relief of a leader who had finally found white officials willing to honor their own laws. The court has also reviewed testimony from Miss Sarah Matthews regarding intercepted telegraph communications. Judge Bradley continued, nodding toward the telegraph operator, who had nearly died to preserve evidence of Blackwood's crimes. Her records corroborate the photographic evidence and establish a clear pattern of criminal conspiracy. Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, the marks of her ordeal still visible in the bruises that Federal Marshal Kane had left during his interrogation. Her courage in preserving the intercepted messages had provided the timeline that connected Blackwood's orders to the violence that followed. Furthermore, the judge announced, the court has examined land documents provided by Chief Running Bear of the Cheyenne Nation, establishing legal ownership of territories that the defendant attempted to claim through fraudulent means. The original land deed that Running Bear had entrusted to Ezra now rested on the judge's bench, its faded ink and official seals representing 40 years of legal precedent that predated Blackwood's schemes. The document had survived wars, massacres, and countless attempts to destroy the evidence of Native American legal claims. Blackwood's attorney, a nervous man whose fee had clearly not prepared him for defending against such overwhelming evidence, attempted one final argument. Your Honor, my client contends that his actions were motivated by legitimate business interests and that any violence was the result of misunderstandings rather than criminal intent. Judge Bradley's expression showed the contempt that honest men felt for lawyers who prostituted their skills in service of obvious criminals. Counselor, your client's correspondence specifically references Sand Creek as a successful model for future operations. There is no misunderstanding the intent behind such statements. The reference to Sand Creek brought nods of approval from the gallery, where territorial officials and local citizens had gathered to witness the downfall of a man whose corruption had affected their communities for years. Many of them had lost friends or property to Blackwood's schemes without understanding the scope of his criminal enterprise. Harrison Blackwood, Judge Bradley continued, raising his gavel for the final pronouncement. This court finds you guilty on all charges. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with your assets to be seized and distributed as restitution to your victims. The gavel's final strike marked the end of an empire built on lies and violence, bringing justice to those who had suffered under Blackwood's greed. For Ezra Stone, it represented something even more precious: vindication for the choice he had made at Sand Creek 21 years earlier. The wedding ring felt foreign in Ezra's weathered hands as he turned it slowly in the morning light streaming through Sarah's kitchen window. 21 years of solitude had not prepared him for the weight of commitment to another human being. Yet something in Sarah's patient smile convinced him that isolation was not the same as safety. It was my grandmother's, Sarah explained, settling beside him at the small table, where they had shared countless conversations since returning from Colorado Springs. She wore it for 47 years, through good times and bad. The horse that had brought them together grazed peacefully in the meadow behind Sarah's house, its coat gleaming with health and contentment. The animal had become something of a local celebrity, visitors coming from neighboring counties to see the horse that had carried evidence of Blackwood's conspiracy across impossible terrain. Children brought apples and sugar cubes, treating the horse like a hero from the adventure stories they read by lamplight. Ezra studied the ring's simple gold band, noting the wear patterns that spoke of decades of faithful wearing. Sarah's grandmother had been a pioneer woman who had crossed the plains with her husband in 1847, enduring hardships that would have broken lesser spirits. The ring carried memories of love that had survived everything the frontier could throw at a marriage. "Are you sure about this?" Ezra asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man who had spent 2 decades convinced he was better off alone. "I'm not exactly what most women would consider a good cat." Sarah's laugh held the warmth of a woman who had found something precious after years of believing she would never love again. "Most women haven't seen you nurse a dying horse back to health or risk your life to protect people you'd never met. I know who you are, Ezra Stone. Through the window they could see Running Bear approaching with 3 of his warriors, their horses moving at the relaxed pace of men who no longer feared pursuit by federal marshals or bounty hunters. The Cheyenne chief had become a regular visitor since the trial, his presence a reminder that some alliances transcended the boundaries between cultures. "The chief wants to give you something," Sarah observed, noting the carefully wrapped bundle that Running Bear carried. "He's been working on it for weeks." Ezra stepped onto the porch to greet his friend, still marveling at how completely his life had changed from the hermit existence he had maintained for 20 years. Running Bear's weathered features showed the satisfaction of a man whose people had finally found justice in white courts. "Stone who speaks truth," Running Bear said formally, dismounting and approaching with the bundle held in both hands. "My people have voted to make you an honorary member of our tribe. This carries the name we have chosen for you." The bundle contained a magnificent war shirt, decorated with traditional beadwork and eagle feathers, each element carrying symbolic meaning that honored Ezra's courage and integrity. The craftsmanship represented hundreds of hours of work by the tribe's most skilled artisans, creating something that no amount of money could purchase. "I'm honored," Ezra replied, accepting the shirt with the reverence it deserved. "But I don't know if I've earned something this significant. You chose to stand with us when your own people would not," Running Bear explained, his voice carrying the authority of a man who spoke for his entire nation. "That choice makes you Cheyenne in spirit, regardless of the color of your skin." Sarah emerged from the house carrying coffee and fresh bread, her movements showing the natural hospitality that had made her beloved in the small community of Cedar Falls. The townspeople had embraced her as a hero since her role in exposing Blackwood's conspiracy became known, but she wore her fame with the same modesty that had characterized her years as a telegraph operator. "Chief Running Bear," she said warmly, "I hope you'll join us for the ceremony next week. Ezra could use some moral support." The Cheyenne leader's smile showed genuine affection for the woman who had captured his friend's heart. "Wild horses could not keep my people away. We have few chances to celebrate happy endings." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the meadow, Ezra found himself contemplating the strange turns that life could take when a man finally chose to trust in something larger than his own fears. The horse that had started everything continued grazing peacefully, a living symbol of how broken things could heal when tended with patience and love. The wedding ring caught the fading sunlight as Sarah slipped it onto her finger, 47 years of faithful love beginning a new chapter in the hands of people who understood that some commitments were worth whatever they might cost. 6 months after the wedding, Ezra Stone knelt beside the oak sapling he had planted in the meadow behind their home, his weathered hands gentle as he worked rich soil around the young tree's roots. The sapling stood barely 3 feet tall, its tender leaves trembling in the mountain breeze, but something in its determined posture spoke of strength that would endure long after the man who planted it had returned to dust. "It'll take 20 years to provide real shade," Sarah observed, settling beside him with the careful movements of a woman whose body had begun to show the first signs of the child they would welcome before winter's end. "Maybe 30 before it's truly magnificent." Ezra smiled at the implicit faith in their future that her words contained, the assumption that they would grow old together in this place they had chosen to call home. After 2 decades of living one day at a time, planning for years ahead felt like a luxury he was still learning to embrace. The horse that had brought them together grazed nearby, its coat gleaming with the health and contentment of an animal that had finally found permanent sanctuary. Local children still came to visit, bringing treats and stories that the horse seemed to enjoy with patient dignity. The animal had become a living legend, proof that sometimes the most unlikely messengers carried the most important news. "Running Bear says his people have a tradition," Ezra explained, patting soil around the sapling's base with the methodical care he brought to all his work. "When a warrior has won a great victory, he plants a tree to mark the place where his old life ended and his new life began." Through the meadow grass they could see the distant peaks where Ezra had spent 21 years in exile, learning lessons about survival that had prepared him for battles he never could have imagined. Those mountains would always be part of him, their harsh beauty and unforgiving demands woven into his character like threads in a tapestry. The memorial stone they had placed at the tree's base bore a simple inscription in memory of Chief Running Bear and all who died defending their people's right to live in peace. The Cheyenne leader had passed quietly in his sleep 2 months after the trial, his spirit finally at rest, knowing that his tribe's lands were protected by federal law rather than the promises of men who had forgotten what honor meant. He would have liked this, Sarah said, reading Ezra's thoughts in the way that married couples learn to do when they truly listen to each other. The idea that something would grow here long after we're gone. A rider approached from the direction of town, moving at the leisurely pace that suggested news rather than emergency. Ezra recognized William Hayes, the photographer whose courage had made justice possible, now established as Cedar Falls' official recorder of births, deaths, and the 1,000 small moments that comprised community life. Ezra Sarah Hayes called out, dismounting and approaching with the slightly formal manner he adopted when conducting official business. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted you to be the first to know. The territorial legislature voted this morning to establish the Running Bear Memorial Park, preserving 20,000 acres of traditional Cheyenne hunting grounds. The news carried weight beyond its immediate meaning, representing recognition that native peoples had legitimate claims to the land that European settlers had assumed was theirs for the taking. It was a small step toward justice, but meaningful progress often came in increments rather than grand gestures. 20,000 acres, Sarah repeated, her voice soft with wonder. That's larger than some eastern state. Hayes nodded, his photographer's eye already composing images of the ceremony that would formally establish the park. They want you there for the dedication, Ezra. As the man who made it possible. Ezra looked toward the mountains that had sheltered him during his years of exile, then down at the oak sapling that would outlive them all if given proper care. Some victories were measured in battles won and enemies defeated. Others were measured in seeds planted and promises kept to future generations who would never know the names of those who had fought for their inheritance. We'll be there, he replied, his hand finding Sarah's as their child moved restlessly beneath her heart. Some debts can only be paid forward. The oak sapling swayed in the mountain breeze, its leaves catching sunlight that would nourish its growth through seasons yet to come. In its shadow, a dying horse had found salvation, carrying secrets that changed the course of history. Now it would stand as witness to the truth that even the smallest acts of courage could reshape the world when performed by people who understood that honor was not a luxury, but a necessity.